Hello everyone, this is Tippeswamy BM. I work as Assistant Professor of English at Government First Grade College, Chitrahalli, Chitradurga District. So now we are into session number 8, and the topic we will be discussing in this session is WB Yeats' poem, A Prayer for My Daughter. So in this session, we'll focus mainly upon the introductory part. I have given a brief introduction about the poet WB Yeats in the beginning, and then we have introduction about the poem, that is A Prayer for My Daughter, and then we'll be analyzing the first two stanzas. Okay, so that is what we will do in this session number 8. So there are two important objectives of this session. The first one is to introduce students to the poetry of WB Yeats, where students will be able to understand WB or significance of WB Yeats as a modernist poet, and what are his major works and his contribution towards the field of English literature. And then we will look into introduction of this poem, A Prayer for My Daughter, what exactly this poem tells us, and we look into the first two stanzas of the poem. So at the end of the session, students should be able to understand the significant role of WB Yeats as a modernist poet, as I have already said, and students will also get an introduction to the poem, A Prayer for My Daughter. It's like having basic idea before we dwell into the major themes of the poem. With this, let us start. So I have given a very brief introduction about this great poet, writer William Butler Yeats. Was born in the year 1865. Yeats was an Irish poet, dramatist, prose writer, and is one of the significant persona of 20th century literature. So, okay, when I say he is one of the significant persona, you must remember the influence, the kind of influence Yeats has on English literature and so many other writers. So his first significant poem was The Island of Statues. It can be called as a fantasy work, and his first solo publication, was the pamphlet Mosada, a dramatic poem. It was published in the year 1886. So try to remember these names of these significant works. It will be helpful for you in competitive examinations. So in the year 1889, Yeats met Maud Gonne. Maud Gonne was a 23-year-old English heiress, and she was an ardent and strong Irish nationalist. So this is a very significant incident in Yeats's life, because Maud Gonne had a deep impact on his personal life, which in turn reflected in on his poetry. So Maud Gonne, she admired his work, The Island of Statues, and she sought out his acquaintance, and they would both become very good friends. And each soon began an obsessive infatuation, and this particular feeling towards her had a significant and lasting effect on his poetry and his life thereafter. So if we try to analyze the poetry of WB Yeats, one particular aspect I tried to focus here, that is Yeats' poetry used symbols from ordinary life and from familiar traditions. Something you will understand when you read his poems. So what I tried to say, that the symbols and images which he uses in his poetry, they are very simple. They are part and parcel of the lives of ordinary human beings, and they are from familiar tradition. People are very much familiar with the tradition of those symbols and imageries. So for example, if we read the poem The Second Coming, it uses the biblical image of the second coming of Jesus Christ, And if you look into Leda and the Swan, you have a story from Greek mythology. So all these are what I am trying to say, that they are very simple, and they are the symbols from ordinary life and from the familiar tradition of people. Some of his notable poems are Among School Children, then Sailing to Byzantium and Sailing from Byzantium. Okay, so these are very significant poems which they tell about the condition of Europe in a war-ridden society. Then we have A Prayer for My Daughter. So this is the poem. We will take it for discussion in this session. Then Leda and the Swan, Easter 1916. So this poem deals with Irish nationalist uprising in Ireland, and so many other poems of William Butler Yeats. And you must know that for his wonderful contribution towards the field of poetry, literature, English literature, he was awarded a Nobel Prize in the year 1923. So this is a brief introduction about the poet and his poetry. So now, as we are intended, we focus on one particular poem by WB Yeats, that is A Prayer for My Daughter. So the title itself is very simple and indicative that it is the entire poem is in the form of a prayer, and this prayer is made by a father to his newborn daughter, okay, for the safety of his newborn daughter. So this is an intensely personal poem. It was written in the year 1919, the same year when he wrote his another famous poem, The Second Coming. So it's an intensely personal poem for the reason that it was written after the birth of his daughter Anne, and it was published in Yeats's poetry collection known as Michael Robartes and the Dancer in the year 1921. Remember, the poem was written in the year 1919, but it got published in the year 1921 in his collection of poetry known as Michael Robartes and the Dancer. And the poem was written just a few weeks after Yeats's daughter was born. She was named as Anne. And the poem speaks about the anxiety felt for the well-being of his daughter, and also about the anxiety shared by all fathers since the world was torn by war and greed. So this is a very significant point to understand this poem. So the father in the poem, the poet WB Yeats, is praying. Okay, he is praying for the safety of his daughter. So there are two aspects to it. The first one is the poet he speaks about the anxiety he felt for the well-being of his daughter. As soon as she was born, he was anxious, a kind of fear. Okay, so in this mood of anxiety, he prays for the well-being or the safety of his daughter. And he also shares his anxiety with all other fathers, because this was the period when the country of Ireland was torn by war and greed. So this was the period where one could see the impact of First World War on Europe. So there was an existential dilemma in most part of the Europe, and this particular aspect is significant in modernist poetry, and WB Yeats belongs to this genre of modernist poetry, where we see that coming to the 20th century, how an individual felt himself to be rooted out, and how anxiety played a very important role in the lives of common human beings. This is very significant in modernist literature, and same can be imprinted here in this poem, A Prayer for My Daughter. So continuing with the introduction about the poem, though the First World War had just ended, Ireland was still in turmoil. This is very important. So Ireland was not a totally free country, or you can see that peace was restored in Ireland. There was still turmoil. So a kind of anxiety was there in the minds of the people. And the poet is worried that his infant daughter has to face the challenges and hardships of the future. So, this is the anxiety which he shares with the readers, that his daughter, who is born in this kind of situation, in this particular historical context where Ireland was still in turmoil, she has to face the challenges and hardships in her future, which means her future is not secured. He cannot see a very comfortable and secured future for his daughter in this war ridden society in Ireland. And the poet, along with praying for the safety of his daughter and her future, he also suggests that some of the characteristics or characters that she must imbibe in herself, which can sustain her future and keep her safe and happy. So, this becomes the subject matter of the poem, that along with praying for the safety of his daughter, he also narrates some of the important characters he wants her daughter to imbibe in herself, so that she can sustain her future and make sure that her future is safe and she is happy. So, this is the introductory part about the poem A Prayer for My Daughter. So, what we will do now, let us dwell into the poem. As I have already mentioned in this session, I will look into the first two stanzas. Okay. So, let me read the first stanza first, and then I will be explaining it, and some of the important, and I will be explaining or trying to analyze what those lines suggest. Once more the storm is howling, and half hid under this cradle hood and coverlid my child sleeps on. There is no obstacle but Grigory's wood and one bare hill, whereby the haystack and roof levelling wind, bred on the Atlantic, can be stayed. And for an hour I have walked and prayed because of the great gloom that is in my mind. So, here he says, so when the poem begins, the poet is in the middle of something when he says once more, so which indicates that this is not the first time this particular phenomenon is happening. Once more, once again, the storm is howling. Look at this, what is happening, what kind of atmosphere he generates. He is explaining to the readers that it is a stormy weather and storm is howling. So, howling is making a fearful sound or noise. So, it's a howling storm outside, and what is happening inside? Half hid under this cradle. So, under this cradle, inside the cradle, half hid under this cradle hood and coverlid, covering her eyes, yes, eyelid covered, my child, my daughter, she sleeps on. Okay, my daughter is sleeping, and what we see outside is stormy weather. The storm is howling, but whereas the child is sleeping in the cradle. So, the poem opens with the image of the child sleeping in a cradle, and the child is half hidden by its head. So, it is not fully covered, it is half hidden by the head or the hood of the cradle, and the eyelids are covered, and the child sleeps innocently. Very important, the child sleeps innocently, and what you see outside, howling storm. But Yeats, the poet, he could not settle down due to the storm inside, that is inside his mind. Yes, there may be a storm outside, a fearful storm howling outside, but there is one more storm which has taken place or which has started in his mind, in his heart, that is fearful anxiety for the future of his daughter, because he cannot imagine her daughter in this war-ridden Irish society. So, it is not just the storm outside which is fearful, the poet is more fearful of the storm inside, where one can see the anxiety for the future of his daughter. So, what happening? There is no obstacle to stop this storm. So the storm is so strong that there is nothing which can stop it. But there is one thing which comes in its way. It's just Gregory's Oot and one bare hill, okay, which refers to the wind which had bred in Atlantic Ocean. It has no obstacles except the estate of Lady Gregory. So who is this Lady Gregory? That is poet's patroness. So it is only the estate of Lady Gregory which comes in between the place where the poet is staying now with his child and the storm which has taken place in Atlantic Ocean. There is no obstacle but Gregory's Oot and one bare hill where by the haystack and roof leveling wind bred on the Atlantic can be stayed. Okay, so there is nothing which can stop the storm which has started occurring in the Atlantic Ocean, and the child, very important, is sleeping near the haystack. So here we have a biblical reference where Jesus Christ, when he was born, he was made to sleep near the haystack. So here his child, his daughter, is also sleeping near the haystack, but it is a stormy weather outside and it is rising and it is becoming more and more strong from the Atlantic Ocean. And there is a storm which is going on inside the mind of the poet. And for an hour I have walked and prayed because of the great gloom that is in my mind. The poet says, yes, the direct impact of the wind from the Atlantic Ocean in the form of a storm, it means to the force of the outside world, especially on his daughter, he worries. The poet worries. So the wind, the strong wind, is symbolic of the external force this society and this outside world imposes on his daughter. So what you can see that there is a great gloom. Gloom refers to a kind of sadness in his mind, and he walked continuously for an hour or so, and he prayed for his daughter to be protected from the physical storm outside and also the political storm brewing across the island. So storm is symbolic of the political storm which is rising in Ireland. So it is not just a natural phenomenon here. You must understand that the storm which is rising and creating a kind of threatful atmosphere for his daughter is symbolic of the political storm, the political unrest which is taken place in Ireland. So moving to the second stanza, he says, I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the arches of the bridge and scream in the elms above the flooded stream. Imagining in excited reverie that the future years had come, dancing to a frenzied drum out of the murderous innocence of the sea. Very important stanza. Here, before I explain the lines in this stanza, you must also know that WB Yeats had written a book called A Vision, where in most part of his poems, you can see an incident where the poet or the narrator or the speaker in the poem started visualizing things in the form of a dream or a reverie. So this is a very significant part of his poetry. So same thing happens in this part of the poem also. So I have walked and prayed for the young child for an hour. So I have been continuously walking restlessly and praying for the safety of my daughter. And I heard the sea wind scream. I can hear that the sea wind, the storm is screaming, making fearful noises outside. From where I can hear these noises? From the tower and under the arches of the bridge, and scream it continues even in the elms above the flooded stream. So everywhere you see a kind of unrest. Everywhere you see a kind of fearful atmosphere created by nature, force of nature. So the storm which is rising, making the father, that is the poet, to pray for his daughter continuously. And what else is happening? that he is worried about the future of his daughter. So in the second stanza, Yeats worries about the future of his daughter. He hears the scream upon the tower under the bridge, and the term in the next line when he says, flooded stream symbolizes poet's overwhelming anxiety for his daughter, and it also refers to the great flood which is mentioned in the Bible. Okay, so the great flood has resulted in the destruction of mankind. You have a biblical reference. I have already explained in the beginning or the introductory part that Yeats uses symbols and images from the familiar traditions and day-to-day life. So you have a biblical reference where he tells about the great flood, and the same situation he relates it to the poem. So now he imagines that he is in a state of excited reverie. So reverie is a term which has connotations with dreamy like situation or daydream kind of situation. So he goes into a kind of reverie. So he is daydreaming, and that reverie, in that he sees the future years that had to come. So what kind of future years he sees? That these years, the future, is dancing to the frenzied drum out of the murderous innocence of the sea. These are very powerful and strong lines where he predicts the kind of future Ireland is going to have. That in future the entire country or maybe the entire world will be so frantic, yes, that there will be no sense left. People will be frenziedly dancing to the drum of the sea, where the innocence is totally lost. So people will be so frantic, and they behave in such a way that there is no sense left in human beings, and they will be dancing for the murderous beats, which means the cruelty human beings are going to express in the coming years. So by giving us a kind of prophecy about the future, that what kind of years we are going to witness, the poet finishes the second stanza. So it is for this reason where murderous situation which will arise in the near future is worried about the future of his daughter. So far we have analyzed the first two stanzas of this poem, A Prayer for My Daughter by WB Yeats. Thank you.